all your thoughts a fighting chance. Ask your fears and doubts. Would you like to dance? And open up your eyes. See the world and let the world see you. Take the time to love the things you do, and you hear it when your spirit starts to rise.
Hello, welcome to Paths to Wellness. I'm Christian O'Neill, I'm your host. This is the show where we provide our audience with information regarding the wide variety of approaches to health and healing that are found throughout our society. You know, if you ask most people to name something that they inherited from their family, they wouldn't have any trouble at all. They could say facial features, height, maybe a love of music, or an aptitude for math. But on today's show, we're going to be discussing inheritance of a different nature. Our guest today suggests that along with physical attributes and talents, that oftentimes wounds, both emotional and spiritual, can be passed down from one generation to the next. These wounds can form what he refers to as an invisible burden that remains outside of our conscious awareness. And the problem with this is that these wounds can color our entire lives and sap our authenticity and vitality. So our guest today is George Kamana Hunter. George is a healer of both Irish and Mohawk ancestries. George is the founder of the Bluestone Institute, which provides training in various healing modalities. George's background also includes research conducted in a wide variety of environments as diverse as Memorial Sloan Kettering in Manhattan and the Amazonian rainforest. George is the developer of Bloodline Healing, which is what we're going to discuss today. And Bloodline Healing is a therapy which is designed to allow individuals to, first of all, recognize this invisible burden and then overcome it or let go of it so that they can live with greater authenticity and vitality. So thanks for joining us, George.
Thank you.
So maybe we can start out, you can tell our audience a little bit more about this invisible burden we're talking about.
Sure. Well, as you were saying, there is an inheritance that we seem to have. It's kind of a heaviness that you can feel, but so many people are carrying this heaviness around. It's almost like a grief that we don't know what it's about. So when I first started recognizing this invisible burden was when I was working with Holocaust survivors. It wasn't just the survivors themselves that had this heaviness that they were carrying in their bodies, in their minds, in their everyday awareness. It was also their children and grandchildren. And that's when I began to start wondering why. Why is it that the children and grandchildren who grew up in a completely different country, had economic availability, could go to schools, had lots of love from the people who survived, why is it that they had this heaviness? Well, it wasn't because of an absence of love. It was because they had inherited, along with their gifts, they had inherited something else that was historical. And that's when I started looking more closely at this invisible burden and noticing that regardless if someone was a physician or if they were homeless on the street or they were a millionaire, they were carrying this burden.
And what does that look like in their lives, this burden? How did it manifest?
Well, first of all, you'll notice that people will be moving really fast. They'll be busy all the time. And being alone will be very difficult because when you're alone with the burden, this unspoken thing, so they keep themselves really busy. It's a form of survival mode where we're constantly going, constantly moving. That's your first indication that you're carrying an inherited burden. Otherwise, then when it comes out is usually family gatherings. There's a tension in the air. There's something unspoken that happens in little conversations off to the side. That's another indication that there's an unfinished story in the family. And that unfinished story will be held inside their bodies. So someone has chronic neck pain, another person has ulcers, another person has high blood pressure, just like every other person in their family. Some people have insomnia, some people have depression. These are all conditions that I believe the root cause is the invisible burden, the unfinished story of the family.
And what is it that makes it difficult to recognize, the invisible quality? Why is it that people, these generations seem to perpetuate it and no one really is aware of it?
Well, after a trauma happens, a historical trauma, the first thing you want to do is get relief. You want to get back into a routine. You want to have your normalcy back in your life. You want relief. Well, that's good and that's healthy in the beginning, but there's still some pending stuff that needs to be addressed. What happens though is society doesn't validate that. They say get back to work, get productive again, get busy again, and then we never carve out the space to actually acknowledge what's pending. The other thing is, I think culturally there's a lot of shaming that happens, especially if someone has an addiction or some kind of escape from the burden. They'll shame that. They don't want to talk about it. And until society has clear mirrors and a system of validation that, that this burden really exists, people aren't going to really recognize it. They'll feel it as a weight on their chest. They'll feel it as a pain in their neck. They'll feel it as a resentment that they have to do a family obligation, but they won't really address it.
Okay. And now in your writing, you also mentioned something called the ripple effect.
Yes.
Okay, maybe you can tell us about that.
Well, if you imagine a very calm pond and you drop a stone into the pond, what happens? There's a splash and there's these ripples that come out from there. The splash is the history. It's the traumatic thing that happened to the family. And every ring that comes out of it is a generation that's affected by it. So with the Holocaust, it's a very, very large stone that just splashed, and we're still healing from that. Even people who aren't of Jewish descent are still healing from that. And each ring that comes out is another generation that's affected by it. The first generation has it the worst. The next generation heals a bit more, and eventually those ripples will hit the side of the pond and they'll get smaller. But time by itself does not heal all wounds. We need to be able to address these ripples directly, starting off by talking about it and giving support, even if it happened years ago. Because without that support, it just ripples down to the next generation, the next generation. The burden gets passed down, the burden of the wounds, the heaviness, the grief, passed down, passed down, passed down. Mm-hmm. And really, our ancestors, if you really listen to them, in their clearest moments, what they wish for us is that we don't have to go through the same things that they went through. So really, by addressing this burden, we're honoring our ancestry.
Mm-hmm. And what is it about, why can't families without outside help work through this on their own?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think if everybody's in survival mode and everybody's carrying the burden, there's all sorts of ways that the burden gets shifted onto other people. And if you notice, in every family, there's always that one person, when they pass away, it shakes the family more than anybody else because they're carrying the majority of the burden. When they pass on to the other side, the burden gets redistributed, so to speak. So I think what happens is that people become very invested in keeping certain people holding more of the burden. They don't want to take more responsibility for it. So that's why you have that one or two people in the family that are really strong. They become doctors, they become healers, they're the artists that speak out, and they help the family. They're the ones that the family always goes to when they need help. So I think people have a vested interest, if they're not going to get outside help, in keeping things just the way it is. But it's usually that person who wakes up and says, this burden is too much. I want better for my kids. I don't want them to go through the same things I went through. That's the person who's the catalyst in the family. They're the ones who shake up the structure for a good reason in order to make room for change to actually happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I'm thinking that communication would be a vital part.
Absolutely.
And like you were saying a minute ago, in survival mode, just doesn't lend itself to good communication. So it's kind of a catch-22.
Well, yeah, you have to get people out of survival mode first before they're even going to be able to hear what we're talking about. They might even be watching this show right now and need to shift out of survival mode to hear everything that we're saying. And that's why I use song. I use song to kind of get people out of their busy minds, get them to settle down a little bit into their heart, feel okay, feel comfortable, and then they can actually hear the next level. Because when we're in survival mode, we get tunnel vision. We can only see, we only have enough attention for whatever's going to meet our immediate need. And we're like assessing them. Can this person give me something? Can they give me something? They can't give me something? Okay, they get 3 minutes of my attention, and then you're gone. That's survival mode. That's tunnel vision. We have to invite people out of that and help them to really believe that there is, with help, with outside help, there really is enough to go around. There really is enough support to get through this.
Okay. So the Holocaust is a great example. Maybe, I'm sure the audience would like to know, what are some other just bread and butter type examples of this invisible burden?
I think the pattern of divorce, I think it has everything to do with this burden. Who's carrying it, and then it just kind of, when there's this separation, it's the inability to really meet together and come together as a team in a respectful partnership to cooperatively address the burden. The burden usually gets shifted onto one person or another, or it gets divided up. This person's always the money, the breadwinner, this person is always the one who has to be the emotional caretaker, and it gets divided up like that. So really what happens is, if you carry this burden, when a divorce happens, a lot of the burden shifts onto the kids. The kids have to be the emotional partners, they have to take sides, and even in the best divorces, there's still some burdens that come down, because there's all these feelings that the kids have. Well, they grow up and then they marry someone that matches. It's almost like the scripts match. And when the scripts match, they go through the same separation process again and again and again, like a ripple effect. But if you can really address what happens directly and see that it's not just your story, and it's not just the story of your parents, and it's not just the story of your grandparents, suddenly you realize you're not alone. You're not alone in what you're carrying. And then when you have outside help, you're really not alone, because you can address this pattern and have a successful marriage. That's something I get a lot of.
So the divorce, it sounds like the divorce is both a product of the invisible burden, and then is perpetuating it, contributing to it. Is that
it
true?
Can be, but it can also be part of the healing process. Sometimes people choose to leave the partnership as a way of not validating the burden, as a way of not following the script. The divorce becomes a rite of passage, where they say, my family went through this is the same kind of dynamic has always happened, and I'm stepping out of it. Sometimes a divorce is actually almost like a ceremony that takes them out of it and say, I'm going to live a new life. So either way, the burden has a role to play in both cases, where the divorce is chronic and awareness isn't brought to it, and when awareness is brought to it and one or both of the partners just realizes that this is what they have to do to grow.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about the bloodline healing itself. What are the elements of it, and how do they function in releasing this invisible burden?
There's a couple ingredients you need to make this cake, so to speak. First of all, you need support. You need support that's unconditional. Sometimes that comes from the family, but very often people have to go outside the family into these bloodline healing circles to find other people who are going through the same struggles as they are. The next ingredient is actually being able to thin the veil, meaning between this world and the next world. One of the big things I come up against, not necessarily in small cultural communities like Native American communities, but in the mainstream, American culture, there will be these private moments where they can feel the presence of their grandmother or their grandfather, or and they know that they're there. They smell the perfume. They can feel a hand on their shoulder. But for the most part, a lot of people have a big barrier with this part of the healing process. It's almost like when people die, they don't exist anymore, or they exist in a very far away place and it has nothing to do with their life right now. But I challenge that belief, because I believe by thinning that veil of resistance between us having contact with our ancestors, much like you see in Jewish communities and Native American communities, they have a close relationship with their ancestors. I think there's tremendous benefit, because what can happen is some of that support that you didn't get can come to you, and some of the burden that was never yours can go to them. So that's the big element right there, is support, thinning the veil, and actually exploring your beliefs in a very open way, that maybe there is a way to get what you never got. Maybe there is a way to let go of the burden and the pain that your family, had as experiences. Maybe there is a way to be free of that. And everything from there starts from that core, and there's any number of approaches we can take from there that's, almost like a fluid dance.
Okay. So the assistance of your ancestors is just a crucial part
Absolutely.
of this therapy. Okay, and you just said a moment ago, actually shifting some of the burden back to them.
Yes.
What's that like? Is that, I mean, is that put them in a bad position on the other side in any way, or?
Not my impression. My impression is what it's really about is people on this side, you know, the living family members getting over guilt.
Okay.
There's this tremendous guilt that, you know, not carrying a burden on behalf of your family is a bad thing. I don't mean to say responsibility. Responsibility in a family is a good thing. I'm talking about pain from like historic events, feelings of inadequacy, shame because of historical, you know, circumstances, cultural shaming, things that happen between two different cultures. Those kinds of things we don't need to hold on to belong to our family. So what actually happens is, rather than dumping it on an ancestor, so to speak, what you're actually doing is, in their expanded capacity on the other side, you're saying, can you help me with this? And what happens is it gets divvied up. You see, we cut ourselves off from all that support. Think of how many ancestors you have, generations back. If one person's carrying the burden, which often happens in a family, it's usually the mothers, by the way, very often, and sometimes men carry the burden as well. If you have 1,000 hands holding this burden, that's a whole nother scenario. But there is something very special about being here and alive with the consequences that they can't completely be in because they're no longer embodied. There's something about being here and raising the next generation directly that is like the point of power. If you're here, you have the power to change the direction your family is heading.
Okay, excellent. Now, George was good enough to take me through the therapy yesterday, and we have some video footage of that. But you did want to make mention of one thing.
Yes, I first want to say what you're about to witness is not a specific ceremony from any native culture or any other culture. This is a style of healing that I developed on my own, and the songs that you were here were also developed in the moment. They were not pre-recorded songs, they were songs that came through at the moment. So any similarities between this and a ceremony of any kind of native tribe is purely coincidental.
Okay, very good. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the video.
So tell me about your family tree.
Okay, we'll start on my dad's side. And first of all, the overriding thing is my dad's side family is just not real close.
You know, as I read this and I read you speaking about this, this was a huge holding place right here for your family. It was like the fire would come up here on your mom's side and splash out. On your dad's side, it was just very damp right here. It was very cold and damp right here. So it was like one side was really hot and fiery, the other side was just cold and distant. So what I want to help you to do is just kind of, you know, feel okay with this inherited fire that you have. So I'd just like to call the ancestors here in Christian's family that have the clearest intent to help him heal, to help supply him with what he never got, that this is a safe place that respects his boundaries, respects who he is as a human being. I'm going to use my hands to break up this area. It's going to be a slapping sound. Don't worry, it won't hurt, And we're just going to let you rest for a few moments, okay? You're welcome. Good work.
Okay, great. So now I'm going to share my experience in just a moment, but before I do, why don't you just tell the audience what is the overall aim of Bloodline Healing?
Well, I believe if we can lift this burden, which is connected to a lot of different chronic conditions and a lot of problems in our relationships, if we can lift the burden underneath the burden, I think what you're going to discover is these innate gifts. You're going to feel really good about being part of your family, about having the artistic abilities of your grandfather, about having the empathy of your mother. You know, these gifts that you inherit, your intellect, all of these things that really people remark about you, musical talent. I think these things will actually be able to come to the surface more fully. So a lot of times our wounds can be seen as doorways, and if we go through that doorway and lift the burden of them, we can find that gift and really claim it in a way that the whole community can benefit.
Okay. So if you remain unaware of this burden and you're in survival mode, you're not getting the gifts either. They're obscured.
Right. That's right. That's right. You only have a very limited access to your gifts, and sometimes it's only when you're painting, for instance, that you switch out of survival mode long enough to actually experience the gift.
Okay. And so just in terms of my own experience, we just did this yesterday, and I can tell you, first of all, my experience with George was that he was very intuitive. We went over my family tree briefly for 15 minutes maybe, but he seemed to have a very good understanding of the dynamics in general terms. Yeah. And then we brought in one ancestor, and it was my grandmother. And when the session was over, I had a new appreciation for my grandmother. Wow. That and I shared it with you. It was a little personal, but it was really nice. So I can see how just in that one session, I was given a gift. Absolutely. Right. So most people I know are interested in what the applications of bloodline healing are, and you have a good story that is demonstrative of what can happen with this therapy.
Absolutely. There was this is a very dramatic story, actually. It happened over a period of 6 months. There's this woman, a Native woman, who actually found herself homeless for the first time in her life. And she worked as a nurse. She was very, intelligent, very competent, but she had this story that she was carrying from, basically growing up on the reservation of abusive relationships. Well, she had to leave her partner, and that's how she ended up homeless. She was basically couldn't provide for herself at the time, and so we helped her find housing and what have you. The work that her and I did together with Bloodline Healing was addressing this script, this burden, this shame and grief that came with how she grew up. So by shedding this with the help of her ancestry, she was actually able to address the abuse directly and find supportive allies that she never felt around her before. As a result, she was able to get back into housing. She was able to get a job and maintain it because the grief wasn't weighing down her ability to get up in the morning anymore. And she went through this rapid grieving process, which was very, very emotional, but very powerful. And as a result, she was also able to connect with her children, who she had been estranged from for many years. Mm-hmm. Last I heard, her children had moved in with her so that they could really kind of like heal what the family never did, so she could give that mothering that she never got. And it was really beautiful to hear that she had the courage to face this burden, to walk through it, to let it go, and really connect with her children in a way that they could have a solid family again. Mm-hmm. Also, her health problems like insomnia, high blood pressure, and gastroenteritis that she was experiencing significantly reduced as a result of this work.
Interesting. That is powerful. And you had told me previously that she was actually adopted. So she
That's
was
right.
Carrying a burden from two different
families. And they usually, in my impression, they usually match up. But our concept of bloodlines isn't just our family. It can also be the family that we take on later on in life, or if we're adopted as children. Okay. So she was actually carrying the burden of two families.
Mm-hmm. All right, now here's a question. She's going through this as an individual.
Right.
And I just had that one session yesterday. Can family members go through this together?
Absolutely. Okay. I've worked with a very common combination is mother and daughter. I don't know why, other than they tend to be more willing to draw support from each other and talk about their feelings. So I think that's a big plus. But all of this happens in some kind of one-on-one with group support. There's always group support. But I have worked with whole families before, and it's very difficult because it really tells, people really have to look at what's not working in the family. But when they start seeing that this isn't new, it isn't specific just to their lives, that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents went through something similar, and you connect it with the history, they're more willing to look at it. They're more willing to say, okay, this is something we inherited, it's something we have to work through together, and we can do it.
And even if an individual, if their family was unwilling to participate, if someone were to go through this therapy and gain some significant healing,
absolutely,
it can still benefit the rest of the family?
Absolutely. It more often happens that way. It's very rare to get a whole family that's willing to work at it. Those highly motivated people are the gems of the family because they go out, they get the support, they transform, they let go of the burden, and they come back to the family, and they don't even have to say anything. Just being around, it's almost like, resonating a guitar string. People start coming up to them and saying, I wanted to tell you something, and they talk about a family secret. And once they share that secret, it starts the whole healing process. The secrets lead to the invisible burden. The invisible burden, with support and lifting it, leads to healing.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So George, Kamana Hunter, there are going to be some people out there that may want to get in touch with you.
Sure.
What's the best way for them to do that?
By cell phone, they can call area code 646-296-2194. They can go on my website, bluestoneinstitute.com. That's all one word. And also, we'll have an upcoming website called healingourbloodlines.com. And that's after the book, Healing Our Bloodlines.
Okay, yeah, and tell us about the book.
The book is basically kind of like the Journal of a Healer. And I travel from Manhattan to the Amazon, to New Mexico, to California. And each place teaches me something new about this work. And it's also a good guide for practitioners because there's a lot of techniques and approaches that are used in the book for people that want to get a little bit more in depth.
And have you thought about training any other clinicians?
I do. I actually have a few graduates from my Bluestone Institute that are training in bloodline healing directly. They happen to be therapists and physicians, and I am looking for practitioners who are already out there doing the work in the field that just want to take their work to a deeper level in terms of what's inherited, the inherited stuff, and the behind the scenes kind of things that we talk about in the book.
Excellent.
So yep, this is a call out to all practitioners. If you're interested in studying with me, please seek me out.
Excellent. Very good. Okay, George Kamana Hunter, thanks so much for coming on and sharing Bloodline Healing with us.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Okay, we're back. I want to thank everyone down here at Quote Unquote for giving us the airtime. I want to thank the crew, especially John, the producer. Also want to thank the viewers for watching. If you like what you're seeing, check us out online, www.pathstowellness.net. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you can send them to me at drO@pathstowellness.net. So we're out of here. Before we go, we want to leave you with something to chew on. We call it the Cud. This week's Cud comes from Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, "Our bodies and our minds have the capacity to heal themselves if we allow them to rest." So thanks a lot for watching. Until next week, remember, it's your body, learn to care for it. It's your mind, learn to focus it. It's your heart, learn to awaken it. Peace.
Keep on opening doors.